Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you to this online session. My name is Asha Abesekara, and I'm a lecturer at the Center for Women's Studies at the Department of Sociology. And I am looking forward to the talk by Dr. Anika Haque and for hosting this session. On to the event now. We will be hearing from Dr. Anika Haque on gender inequality in reaching sustainable development goals. She will discuss the ways in which the cities in the Global South demonstrate the structural marginalization of urban women using case studies on the Slum Rehabilitation Housing Scheme in Mumbai, India. Anika is an assistant professor in human geography and environment at the University of York. Her research is interdisciplinary and grounded in systems thinking, situated at the intersections of society, international development, and governance. Anika is particularly interested in the everyday and embedded structures and gendered inequalities at the city level. Much of her research over the last decade has focused on cities around the Global South. So without further ado, Anika, over to you.
Great. So thanks again, Asha, for introducing me and hosting this session. And thanks to you all who have joined this session today. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, from whichever part you are joining us today. So as the title suggests, today I'll be talking about gendered vulnerability in Global South cities, particularly looking at the low-income urban settlements. I will start with giving you a brief overview of the global urbanization processes so that you can put this talk into the context of why studying Global South cities is important and why is it important to understand the dynamics, gender dynamics in slums in Global South cities. So in 2008, for the first time, more than half the world's population was living in urban centers, and the proportion continues to grow. By 2050, 70% of world's population will be living in urban areas. As you can see in these images, if you go from left to right, from 1950 to 2050, you'll see that the intensity of the color blue is getting darker. That means the world is urbanizing. According to the most recent estimates from the United Nations, 2 out of 3 inhabitants in 2050 will live in urban areas, and most of this urban growth will take place in Asia and the West African belt. Between 1950 and 2018, the median level of urbanization in Asia increased from 27% to 59%. In 2018, 19 countries in Asia were more than 75% urban, including several of the region's most populous countries. So for example, Japan, 92% urban, South Korea, 82% urban. China's population has grown to 1.4 billion in 2018, and 59% of whom resided in urban settlements. The population size of India more than tripled since 1950 to 1.35 billion. And the level of urbanization nearly doubled, reaching 34% in 2018. Now, if I ask you to close your eyes and imagine what a city looks like, the most common answer that I get is something like this, right? So flashy images of cities with skyscrapers, flyovers, high-tech infrastructural services, right? But the situation is quite different in the Global South context. So this might be true in the Western context, but in Global South, the images of a city might look like this or this, where the urbanization processes are being accompanied by growing proliferation of slums and squatters and informal settlements like this. Just under 1 in 3 urban dwellers live in slum households, and the absolute number of people living in slums or informal settlements grew to over 1 billion, with 80% attributed to 3 regions, as you can see in this illustration. Eastern and Southeastern Asia, 370 million, Sub-Saharan Africa, 238 million, and Central and Southern Asia, 227 million. and an estimated 3 billion people will require adequate and affordable housing by 2030. Now, slums are basically the byproduct of states' inability to meet the growing housing demand from overpopulation, excessive rural-urban migration, and poverty. And the growing number of slum dwellers is a result of urbanization and the associated population growth that are outpacing the construction of new affordable homes. Now, adequate housing is a basic human right, and the absence of it negatively affects urban equity and inclusion, health and safety, and livelihood opportunities. Now, if we add a gender lens to this context, half of the world's population is female, and 70% of the world's poor are women. Now, why is it so? There are a few obvious reasons. A, low wages. Across the world, women are in the lowest paid work. B, lack of decent work. 75% of women in developing regions are in the informal economy, where they're less likely to have employment contracts, legal rights, or social protection, and are often not paid enough to escape poverty. C, unpaid care work. Women do at least twice as much unpaid care work, such as childcare and household works, as men, sometimes 10 times as such, often on top of their paid work. The value of this work each year is estimated at least 10.8 trillion US dollar, more than 3 times the size of the global tech industry. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals specifically addresses these issues around gender equality. So, for example, Goal 5 talks about achieving gender equality and empower all women and girls, recognizing and valuing unpaid care work, domestic work through provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies. And also ensuring women's full participation and equal opportunities in the decision-making processes. There is also other goals which are which includes issues around gender equality within its targets. For example, reducing inequalities. It talks about promoting social and economic inclusion irrespective of sex. Now, these are not standalone goals. There are several other goals which are intricately connected with these 2 goals that specifically mentions about gender equality. There is Goal 11, which talks about sustainable cities, making cities and human settlements inclusive, access to safe, inclusive, and accessible public spaces, in particular for women. There is the other goal, Goal 1, which talks about no poverty, equal rights of all men and women to basic services and economic resources. Now, as you can see that these Sustainable Development Goals are interconnected, interrelated. So we need to take, we cannot take siloed perspective to achieve these goals, right? So we need to take a whole systems approach to understand and address this sort of interconnection and achieve these goals. So now I will try to give you a quick understanding about what do we mean by inequality so that you can have a background understanding on the topics that we're discussing today. So as the term suggests, like inequality is all about the quality of being unequal or uneven, such as social disparity, disparity of distribution, or opportunity, lack of evenness. Now, there are 2 broad approaches to inequality within the development studies literature. The first revolves around understandings of poverty in terms of resource deficits at the individual or individual household level. Now, early studies envisaged these deficits primarily in income terms, and this has been gradually replaced by a more kind of like multi-dimensional understanding of poverty, extending the analysis of deficits to assets as well as human capabilities like health and education. But poverty continues to be measured at the level of individuals. This has given rise to what has been described as the vertical model of inequality, based on the ranking of individuals or households by their income, assets, or human resource deficits. So this vertical model of inequality is more about what you have. Now, the other approach to inequality revolves around the analysis of social discrimination. It takes identity-based disadvantage as its entry point into the analysis of inequality, where the disadvantage in question operates at the level of groups rather than individuals. Now, these gives rise to what has been described as horizontal model of inequality that cuts across the different strata that make up the vertical model. The inequalities that we are discussing here under the horizontal model are the product of social hierarchies, which define certain groups as inferior to others on the basis of devalued aspects of their identity. These may be inherited aspects of identity, such as race, ethnicity, caste, or they may reflect the cultural meanings associated with aspects of the life course, so for example, childhood or old age, or the deviations from what is considered the norm in different societies, such as disability or sexual orientation or minority religion, or simply based on gender. So social hierarchies are created between groups through norms, values, and practices which serve to routinely disparage, stereotype, exclude, ridicule, and demean certain groups relative to others, denying them full personhood and the right to participate in the economic, social, and political life of the society on equal terms with others. So this horizontal model of inequality is more about who you are. Now, these two approaches thus focus on quite distinct axes of disadvantage. As you can see in the vertical model, it's more about resources, what you have, and the horizontal model talks about more like identity and who you are. Gender, for instance, cuts across the economic strata so that women tend to occupy a subordinate status relative to men within this different strata. Now, the target group that we are talking about today falls actually at the intersection of these two types of inequality. We will be talking about women from the lower income group. Now, there are other dimensions to social exclusion that are not fully captured by the interplay between economic deprivation and identity-based discrimination. For instance, social exclusion frequently entails a spatial dimension. So, for example, in urban areas, as you can see in this image, it's likely to be associated with slum neighborhoods, which are poorly served by infrastructure and social services, and characterized by high levels of violence, criminality, drug dependence, and squalor. Now, this spatial dimension of exclusion or inequality is not entirely divorced from its identity and resource-based dimensions, since it is often that culturally devalued and economically impoverished groups that inhabit adverse physical locations like this. Now, this inequality can be structural when it is institutionalized through policies. When policies does not allow some groups of people to obtaining the resources to better their lives. So structural inequality occurs when the fabric of organizations, institutions, governments contains an embedded bias, which provides advantages for some members and marginalizes or produces disadvantages for other members. A classic example of this can be South Africa during the apartheid period, when the Black and colored communities were structurally marginalized from the white communities. Now, coming to the specific case that we are going to talk about today, the case is Mumbai. The largest urban agglomeration and the financial capital of India. And being the financial capital of India, it attracts large migration of labor force, where the slums offer the most affordable housing option. Presently, as you can see in this image, slums form a significant part of Mumbai's urbanscape, with more than 50% of the city's population residing in them. Although eradication of informality from urban spaces has been the classical approach to efficient planning, the more recent neoliberal theories advocate rehabilitation of slums. The perpetuity of slums in Mumbai is an unsettling reality at odds with the growing economy of the city. And as a solution to this theoretical ambiguity and anxiety of accommodating the advances of economy while tackling the proliferation of slums and to meet the sustainable development goals, government of Maharashtra has adopted the policy of the slum rehabilitation process. This is a very unique policy and has been started being adopted by other parts globally, other parts of the world. So let me tell you briefly about what this policy entails. So this policy is an efficient process articulated through incentivizing the private sector to participate in the redevelopment of slum communities. So this model creates a win-win scenario for all the involved stakeholders: the government, the private sector, and the slum dealers. Now, the slum dealers get the ownership of a rehabilitation unit at zero cost. And these are permanent housing units with all the basic services within this sort of tenement. So they have water supply, they have electricity, and so on and so forth, which was not there in most of the slums. And the government uses the land occupied by the slums as a resource to subsidize housing for urban poor, while effectively tackling the problem of land shortage and closing the housing deficit. So these horizontal slums are being cleared and they are rehabilitating these sort of vertical buildings. So these, and that's how they get the land cleared for, and they can use it for development purposes. Now, the private sector benefits through free of cost access to the prime city lands with only obligation to aid in the redevelopment process. This also fulfills the state government's contribution towards providing every citizen access to adequate housing, then thus, ticking the boxes for sustainable development goals. Now, although the slum rehabilitation policy seems economically promising, the benefits are myopic. This is how these housings look like. The units are restricted to an area of approximately 24 square meters with no basic guidelines for design, energy efficiency, or gender considerations. If you zoom into inside these sort of tenements, you can see that there are dark corridors. The tenements, the households cannot open their windows. So there are two types of prototypes. In one type of prototype, they can open the window towards outside, but because of these buildings are very closely spaced, even if they open the windows, they won't get any natural light and ventilation. So they use minimum amount of land to house maximum number of households. So the result is this sort of, inside the tenements, there is lack of natural light and ventilation. There are the other prototype where the windows open towards the corridors. But then again, these windows are sliding windows, again, to reduce the cost of building these structures, because sliding windows apparently have lower production cost in comparison to swing windows. So even if they want to operate these windows, they can only operate it at 50% capacity. So you can understand there is a huge reliance on artificial light and ventilation inside these tenements. And because of the lower income, they are very unlikely to use artificial lights and ventilation. So the result is, dams and moistures developed in the walls. It's a very unhealthy and unhygienic situation inside this sort of tenements. And now women are the ones who spend most times indoors amongst all the household members. Now, comfort practices in these sort of low-income households are a trade-off between income and energy expenditure. and women becomes the shock absorber. The increased electricity cost after they have been rehabilitated into these sort of vertical buildings is mainly absorbed by the female occupants, who refrain from using electrical appliances for their own comfort practices and only operate for the children and male occupants' needs. The result is women suffer chronic illnesses. High occupancy combined with poor ventilation options and time spent indoors by female members of the family cause respiratory health burdens such as tuberculosis and asthma, particularly among women in productive age. Now let's try to have a whole systems view, trying to understand what happens after women moves from slums to these sort of slum rehabilitation housings. As we have already started seeing that there is increased household cost, so the electricity cost goes higher because of more reliance on artificial means of light and ventilation. Previously in slums, what happens is that, as you all know, that in slums, the electricity connections are mostly illegal, so they have to pay per connection. So roughly they used to pay, let's say, 100 Indian rupees, which is equivalent to 1 British pound per connection. So if you have 3 connections, you would roughly pay 300 Indian rupees. But after moving to the slum rehabilitation housings, what we have found that their energy expenditure has been doubled. So it is at least 600 Indian rupees, and it can go up to 1,500 Indian rupees, depending on how you're using artificial means of light and ventilation. So yes, so there is increased energy cost, as you can see in this diagram. There is also increased maintenance costs. So there are a flat price that you need to pay for maintaining the building. So there are lifts, there are communal lights. So they need to pay roughly Indian rupees 400 to maintain the building. So even if they can't have 3 times meal a day, they have to pay this maintenance cost. And after living in those tenements for certain years, they are liable to pay the property tax as well. There is increased travel costs as well. So some of these settlements are in situ, so they are rehabilitated on site, but most of these settlements are, like rehabilitated out in the outskirts of the city where there are land available. So that means that they have to travel to work. So there is increased travel cost or transport cost. Education is also another thing. After moving to this sort of like settlements, those are, as I mentioned, mostly located outskirts. They are moved from slums to the outskirts, but the associated services and infrastructure hasn't been developed to accommodate the growing number of populations in that part of the city. So what happens is that the schools are oversubscribed, so there is no space in the public schools. So they have to get resort of private schools. So there is increased education cost as well. Now, when it comes to deciding on who gets priority, a boys education or girls education, being a patriarchal society, a boys education always takes the priority on top of like girls' education, because there is this assumption and like cultural perception that girls will get married and they will go to another house, and it's boys who will look after their parents in their old ages. So you can see that there is an increase in education cost as well. Then there is an increase in recreation cost. So what happened in slums is that like kids can play outdoors while the neighbors can do social policing. So like the neighbors can look after the kids when the women are off to like work. So these sort of like public spaces, where communal spaces were available in slums. But after moving to this sort of like slum rehabilitation housings, there are no accessible communal spaces where the kids can play. On top of that, the way these buildings are placed to maximize the use of land it creates lots of negative and dark spaces, which becomes a ground for antisocial activities like drug and so on and so forth. And there has been many cases of child abduction in this sort of slum rehabilitation housing. So parents don't feel safe to send their kids to play in this sort of outdoor spaces. So there is an increase in recreation costs. So they have to buy laptops or, like televisions or entertain their kids one way or the other. So as you can see, there is like severe increase in household costs after moving from slums to this sort of slum rehabilitation housing. So that means that women are under kind of like more pressure of earning, even if it's like female-headed households, they need to earn more. Even if it's male-headed household, they need to help the main bread earner to earn more. So women are more and more getting engaged into income generating opportunities. Now, there is another aspect. If you look at this side of the diagram, if you can follow my cursor, the lack of accessible social spaces, communal spaces, means that there is no social interaction with the neighbors. That means that there are no social capital being developed after they move to these sort of slum rehabilitation housings. Now, it's not necessarily that all the neighbors from the slums will be rehabilitated in the same building. It follows a procedure. So there are, like a list made, and whoever goes up in the list will be rehabilitated into whichever housing is available. So it's not necessary that the whole community will be rehabilitated in the same building. So in the slums, the social capital that they had developed for years are broken when they move into the slum rehabilitation housings. And because of lack of accessible communal spaces in these sort of housings, there is no new social capital that are being built. Now, social networks that has been associated to be the main factor in satisfaction among slum dwellers seem to be missing in slum rehabilitation housing. The words most respondents used to describe the neighbors while we were doing the fieldwork there was unknown, unreliable, unaccommodative, non-helpful, no help at times of needs and emergency, lack of trust, and so on and so forth. As you can understand, like the repercussions of not having any social interaction. So since there is no social interaction, there is no access to information. So what we identified that, like in those sort of slum housings, there are some NGOs or government initiatives that are providing, like vocational training specifically for women, but this information doesn't reach most of the women in these sort of slum housings because there are no social interaction. So no access to information means that they cannot access organizational support, even if there are supports there in those sort of communities. That means that women's self-development is hampered, and they are stuck into a less skilled job, rather being trained through these sort of organizational supports and getting involved in more kind of like formal economy and more skilled work. So there are other repercussions generated through this sort of broken social capital. One is you can say the time poverty. So because women are spending more time, women needs to spend more time in income generating opportunities. At the same time, they have more childcare responsibilities because of lack of reliance on neighbor, unlike what was happening in the slums. There is a time poverty created. And not being able to develop their skills and being engaged in formal economy, there is a poverty loop also created, being stuck in informal economy and less skilled jobs. So you can see that there are several types of poverty loop created within the systems after being rehabilitated from slums to this sort of slum rehabilitation housing. Now, what do we mean by poverty loop? What do we mean by poverty trap? So A poverty trap or cycle of poverty are caused by self-reinforcing mechanisms that cause poverty to persist once it exists, unless there is an outside intervention. And it can persist across generations. Households or individuals trapped in poverty cycle have usually either limited or no resources. And there are many other disadvantages that collectively work in a circular process, making it virtually impossible for individuals to break this cycle. And this occurs when poor people do not have the resources necessary to get out of poverty, such as financial capital, education, social network, or connections. In other words, impoverished individuals do not have access to economic and social resources as a result of their poverty. And this lack may increase their poverty. This could mean that the poor remain poor throughout their life. Now, let's have a look at two specific cases, trying to understand their own stories. So case one is Geeta, and case two is Sarita. These are imaginary names, but real cases. Both Geeta and Sarita lives in two slum rehabilitation housings. Now, Geeta gets trapped in this poverty cycle, and Sarita managed to break out of this poverty cycle. Now, there is this one common factor that allowed Sarita to break this poverty loop, and that lack of that particular factor trapped Geeta into this poverty cycle. And what was that particular one factor? What we identified that one particular factor was accessible communal social space. So what happened in Sarita's case? She lived in a slum rehabilitation housing, which had which is a unique one, which was a one-off housing built under one of the schemes called Rajiv Gandhi Awas Yojana under the slum rehabilitation process. So the way these buildings were designed, it created lots of positive open spaces outside the building. So if you see the layout, these cruciform-shaped buildings are placed, and they have created enclosed positive outdoor spaces in between the buildings. And also, these buildings have created spaces at the higher levels as well. In different levels, there are open spaces like this, which allows kids to play. The women's are chatting while they can look after the kids. So what we identified that in Sarita's case, and the case for that the communities that were living in this sort of housings, there was a strong social capital built there. So in Sarita's case, what happened that there was this one NGO who were providing vocational training on sewing. So she availed that training while her neighbors were looking after her young kids. And then after completing that training, she bought, using the financial loans that the NGOs were offering, she bought a sewing machine and started her own business. And that's how she managed to break this poverty cycle. And the only factor was this sort of, having this sort of accessible spaces, which allowed her to build the social capital, which allowed her to capitalize on these capitals, social capitals, and break the poverty cycle. And Geeta was living in this sort of, prototypes that I shared images earlier, which didn't have any accessible communal spaces, and thus she couldn't escape poverty, and they get trapped in the poverty cycle. Now, what happens here is that there is hardly any consultation with beneficiaries. Forget about women. Even if there is any consultation, women's needs, aspirations, voices are hardly represented in these decision-making processes. There is no post-occupancy evaluation to understand how these sort of slum rehabilitation units are being used in practice. So nobody knows, what's happening after they have been rehabilitated into this sort of buildings? What happens after the delivery? And it's clear both from the analysis of the policy documents and the interviews that we conducted that, like the current processes of slum rehabilitation delivery is focused on meeting the housing deficit in economically optimal terms. So when we go back to the Sustainable Development Goals, the practice are largely like ticking boxes for provision of housing and infrastructures in terms of numbers, without any considerations or attentions on the social context or the gendered needs, which are leading to further exacerbation of gendered vulnerability and inequality after they have been moved from the slums to the sort of slum rehabilitation housing. There was a clear disjuncture between policymakers' perceptions and occupants' realities, and this was illustrated by some of the most common words that the households used while we were interviewing and while we were doing the focus group discussions with women. And the terms, the common languages that they used was increased cost, poor income, no childcare, no usable outdoor, lack of social interaction. And none of these terms came up during the discussions with the policy planners, whose vocabulary focused on economic terms, such as housing deficit, larger number of housings, free housing, budget, market, developers' profit, land value, and so on and so forth. So what this research has attempted to show is how one material design consideration or intervention, which is not necessarily a gendered consideration, but a consideration that essentially serves all members within the community or society, can have huge implication on positively influencing the gender equality context, and how lack of it perpetuates the gender inequality and traps women in the poverty loop. So addressing gender inequality might not need much in terms of policy or material interventions, or not even much economic incentives, but what it needs more is the perspective, the goodwill, the intention to understand the aspirations of women who falls at the intersection of economic and social inequality. Now, BBC iPlayer has produced a wonderful animation and documentary based on the findings from our research, and it shows the empowering stories of how women in these slum rehabilitation housings has capitalized on their social capital to not only uplift themselves, but also uplift their communities. So I strongly encourage you to look at this animation, which is called A Room in Mumbai. It is available in BBC iPlayer. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anika. I really enjoyed listening to your talk because my work is quite similar, but it's in Colombo, Sri Lanka. We have a few questions on the Q&A, and I'm going to start with the first one. There's a question from Etta, and they're asking, are women involved in any of the policy decisions or logistical decisions around rehousing from slums, or are they marginalized during the decision process as well?
That's a really good question. And as you can imagine, like the practices most in the global South context is that, like these are more like politicking. So it's like stick box. So in paper, it says that there needs to be gendered representation while the decision making is happening. But in practice, hardly any women has been consulted. So it's irrespective of women, actually, like hardly there has been enough consultation with the beneficiaries to understand the context-specific needs, their aspirations, their demands, right? So the lack of consultation means that when the decisions are being taken, the design interventions has been undertaken, that doesn't have any gendered consideration. And then again, when it comes to in generally, not talking about specifically these cases of slum rehabilitation housings, generally what happens in most of the global South context is that this is a highly top-down process. and particularly addressing the sustainable development goals, like the meeting the targets of sustainable development goals is largely like in numbers, as I mentioned. So how many numbers of population you have provided housings for. So it's more about numbers than about quality. So what's happening inside these sort of tenements, nobody cares and nobody knows. So yeah, I think it answers, I hope it answers your question.
Thanks, Anika. I just wanted to clarify, it's not just women. Is anyone being consulted, or is this an entirely top-down process?
So particularly talking about the slum rehabilitation process, as I mentioned, like it's like a politicking. So in paper, it says that numbers of people has been consulted to understand the context-specific needs. But when we went to the field, tried to understand this sort of consultation or, like inclusive decision-making processes, what we identified is that it's more about those sort of politically inclined groups, local influential groups who represent the ruling party, for example, are represented in the decision-making processes. And giving another example of this sort of inclusive, so-called inclusive process is that there is this cooperative that has been built to run this sort of slum rehabilitation housings. And in paper, there has to be a gender representation in these committees. So the committee says that, okay, there are 3 female members in our committee to run this building. But when we went and tried to understand this, in one of the slum rehabilitation housings, what we found that those 3 women, 2 of them were bedridden, very old women who never participated in any of the meetings. So you can see that, like in paper, it says that, okay, we have gender representation in our committees, but when it comes to practice, they make sure that, like those voices are not heard, those needs are not heard. So there is a gap between policy and practice, although there are some components in the policy that address, like, okay, gender needs to be addressed in this process. But when it translates into practice, it's very problematic.
Thanks, Anika. So we have another question, and they're asking, are there any benefits from the move to high-rise housing?
So apparently, the slum dwellers get overwhelmed when they get this sort of, like formal, permanent housing units, because in slums, as you know, that they don't have, they have to use communal toilets or communal services, communal kitchens for regular household chores. But when they moved in this sort of, like permanent housing units, they have all the facilities within their tenements, right? So they have water supply, formal water supply, they have their own toilets and stuff like that. So they are, like very excited in the beginning when they get this sort of housing at 0 cost. Of course, you need to tick certain boxes. You need to meet certain criteria to get this sort of, like ownership of formal housing unit. But as I mentioned, the benefits are myopic. Soon after moving to this sort of, like rehabilitation units, they start realizing the disadvantages, as I mentioned, through breaking social capital and also increased household costs because everything is formalized. So the happiness of moving into a formalized unit in such an expensive city like Mumbai really diminishes very fast as they start living in this sort of tenements.
So related to that, there's another question. The person's asking, is there any solution you can think of which would maintain the community and other positives about slum housing, like easy access to education, work, while also providing better housing? It's a big question, but
yeah, it's a quite tricky question to answer, and there is no straightforward way to answer this. But this is a really important thing, and that's what we are, like studying these settlements to identify ways in which we can cater to this sort of marginalized population, right? So again, like what I said, that there is no thumb rule of achieving this. There is no these are very context specific. Now, just to give you a general understanding, we should start with, of course, being meaningful, inclusive processes, right? So the top down and the bottom up processes needs to be integrated. So the decision-making process needs to meaningfully integrate the needs of all society members. It's not necessarily the gender issue here, but also caste, ethnicity, which are evident in Indian context. All these sort of different segments of the society needs to be included meaningfully in the decision-making processes. If their needs and demands and aspirations are not reflected in the decision-making process, how you can expect, there won't be, vulnerability after moving to this sort of, formal building. So, yeah, so the process should start with participation, meaningful participation of all members in the decision-making processes, and then the translation, that gap between the policies and practices needs to be addressed by proper monitoring and evaluation processes, so that when we are translating the best policies, I mean, like India's have one of the best policies in the world, but when you see the results of this policy implementation, then you start questioning, okay, if we have the best policies, why not we see the results, positive results in practice? So we need to address this gap through monitoring and evaluation, how these policies are translating into practice.
Okay, thank you. So there's another question about the poverty trap you discussed, or the person's asking, can you talk a little bit more about how this impacts families across generations?
Yes, so just to give you an answer in simple terms, as you can understand, like how people get trapped into a poverty cycle, like when there are repeated vulnerabilities and when there is no external interventions, they get trapped into informal economy, less skilled jobs. So if there is no external intervention, like NGO intervention, who are providing vocational training to get them involved in more skilled jobs, if lack of this sort of, like external intervention, they get trapped. Now, these poverty trap, what we have identified in many of the global south contexts, in Mexico, South Africa, in India, in Bangladesh, is that because there is no external intervention trying to break this poverty trap, and because of the repeated exposure to vulnerability, like apart from this sort of, vulnerability deriving from being marginalized from the decision-making processes, lack of access to basic services, lack of access to infrastructure, lack of access to education, these all kind of like piles up to create and sustain this poverty trap. And that's how, it sustains over generations if there is no external intervention. So that's why, and that's what is very evident in many of the global south contexts, that, people get trapped for generations in this poverty trap. And when you add further lenses to it, so for example, climate change, that these are adding further vulnerabilities to these sort of lower income marginalized groups. So as you can see, over time, risks are not getting less, but more risks are adding for this sort of marginalized group. And that's how they get trapped into a poverty cycle for generations.
Right. Thank you. There's a question from Kanupriya, who's asking whether organizational support for women in terms of promoting collective savings and improving livelihoods, such as maybe sewing, be a determinant in breaking the poverty trap despite suboptimal rehabilitated housing?
Again, like this, the answer might be different depending on the context. Now, we all know that, like NGOs, there are many non-governmental organizations who are there in many of those slums, providing services for these marginalized groups. So for example, as I mentioned, vocational trainings or financial schemes and loans. So these are definitely have proven to be vital factors for women empowerment. That's true, right? But what we are talking about here is that what if the women do not have access to that information, that, okay, there is this organizational support within my communities. If they don't have that sort of social networks, that they don't have access to that information of the services that are being delivered within the settlements, they cannot access that service, right? So definitely these services are vital for breaking the poverty trap, but there are certain problems that exist at the root. what if, like, I can't access that information? So we need to address the root causes here, and help maximize the benefits of having this sort of external organizational support.
Thank you, Anika. There's two more questions for now. Yashashwini is asking about the practice in some other Indian cities where some slum dwellers rent out their rehabilitation units and continue to kind of live in slums, and wanted to know whether you've come across this situation in Mumbai.
Yes. I mean, like, that's really great that you addressed that. So what's happening? I'm talking about this particular Mumbai case, but as you can understand, this is the same case with other parts in the global south as well. So we have identified gentrification in these sort of slum rehabilitation housings. So this is Mumbai, right? So one of the most expensive city in the world. So a formal housing, permanent housing unit in this city is really, really expensive, right? So what's happening is that 34% of the population as of 2018 has sold their rehabilitation unit to middle income group. And what we have identified that, and they have also gone back to, like, some other slum pockets and started living in another slum, right? So this doesn't solve the core problem. So what's happening is that the gentrification is growing in this sort of slum rehabilitation housings, and middle income group has started buying, like, more neighboring tenements, and they have expanded the tenements. So it's not anymore, in many of the tenements, it's not anymore the 24 square meter. So they have joined 2-3, like, tenements and have a larger house. So yes, gentrification is very much existent in Mumbai and other parts of the world, global south context particularly.
Okay, so there's another question for you about any other businesses that operate in the slums. Says won't clearing the slums add to poverty if they're cleared, which will impact on, I think you already addressed this in your presentation, but I think they're asking about what kinds of businesses that operate in the slums, which are not necessarily, I suppose, transferable when they move to the high-rise vertical buildings.
So when they were in slums, what again I'm talking about the fieldwork that we conducted in 4 of the slum rehabilitation housings in Mumbai. What we identified that they capitalize on the social capital. So there is a strong women-led social network within the slums, which not only uses that sort of networks to access external, like, business opportunities. So, for example, as you can see in one of the images, they are using they are making flour. How do you say, the flour breads, and that they're selling it outside. They are using sieving businesses. So, for example, they are sieving clothes and so on and so forth. So these are based on, like, collective women networks, and they use these networks to access more business opportunities, to access, like, outside sources, outside information. And when they move into this slum rehabilitation housing, most of the businesses that we found was independent, individual, rather accessing or using the social networks. And it's obvious because the social capital that is very strong in the slums has been broken after being moved here. And in many cases, we have found that there are, like, educated women who have done, like, undergrad, is stuck inside the house just looking after their kids, because, like, they don't have they have extra care responsibilities after moving to these sort of slum rehabilitation housings, and they don't have time to go beyond the housing units and get engaged in skill jobs. So yeah, there are different types of income generating opportunities that the slum rehabilitation housing women are being adopting. But again, like, the social capital that was there in the slums, which helped them to access, like, more business opportunities, was not there. That we couldn't find it in the slum rehabilitation housings.
I think there's one last question about any other case studies besides these 2 women that sort of act as typologies, I suppose, in describing what's happening with the women who've moved to the high-rise tenements?
Yes, so the case studies that we mentioned here, Gita and Sarita, are sample of the two types of groups that we found. So it's not about these two cases or two households, but rather they're representing two different groups within these sort of slum rehabilitation housings. So as I mentioned, like one of the group has managed to break the cycle, and one of the group that gets trapped into the poverty cycle. So yeah, so these are not representing two individuals, but rather two types of groups that you would find in this sort of slum rehabilitation housings.
Thank you, Anika. I think that's all the questions we have on the Q&A. So I think we've just finished right on time. And I want to thank you so much for a really thorough and interesting talk. I really appreciated, especially the very systematic way in which you explain the problem and the different ways in which sort of poverty acts, you know, in the present life, and also how it kind of repeats itself across the generations. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to the audience as well for being here and for asking good questions so that we have some discussion. So just to end the discussion, I wanted to just remind all of you that the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. So you will be contacted by email when the video is available to view. So thank you again to the audience, and thank you, Anika.
Thank you so much. Thank you.